This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Christie, I'm so excited we finally get to meet. It's been a bit to get this conversation going, and I want to just dive right in because there is so much that is going on in our world. And one of the things I love about your work that it has so much synergy with the work that we do with individuals and with organizations and teams is getting to that underlying messy aspect of humanness that either helps us or gets in our way more often than not in our lives, whether we want to recognize it in the moment or not. And so let's just talk about why it is so important that we move beyond our ego and find opportunities for people to actually show up as their best, fully authentic self in their life, but particularly at work.
Such a great question. And one, I'm super excited to be here too. Thank you, Rosie, for having me. Yeah, the world that we live in is very ego driven. Everything is, reactive and fire drill oriented, emotionally responsive. And I think with that being said, it creates a lot of unintentional behaviors, mindsets, and beliefs that we don't even know we're doing. That's really what got me started on the ego work, is learning, one, about my own ego, but two, recognizing that it's just really how our world is designed and our businesses are too. So when one ego shows up, everybody follows suit. So if you have a leadership team that is driven by ego, and I'm not using the traditional ego term of just the loud, arrogant person, I'm talking about just this unconscious habits, mindsets, and beliefs that we all do. They show up in our personal life, they show up in our work life. And unfortunately, leaders, if they're not aware of it, then they are leading without that intention of their next move. They're not proactively thinking about the next words. So there's a lot of messes that have to get cleaned up. There's a lot of miscommunications. There's a lot of micromanaging or undermanaging. And all of those typically go back to whichever ego they fall under and how it's sabotaging their good intentions.
I'm so glad you clarified the ego, because there's people that go, oh, this person has such an ego. And, the way I would love to know how you describe it, the way that I describe ego is it's that filter we all have on reality, right? Those mindsets, beliefs that leads us wanting to please, to perfect, to perform, or to ultimately self-protect. And it's very limiting. And I love how you talk about we have to be aware of it, because our brains are designed to be efficient, which means that depending on the research you look at, 90% of the time we are walking around on autopilot because that's an efficient brain. But that autopilot being driven by that unconscious, the ego, the beliefs that aren't helpful, that are limiting, that are self-protective. And you put a bunch of us together in a team in our workplace, and we do have some disastrous consequences that show up. So can you talk about what, from your perspective, are some of those most common limiting beliefs or those ego filters that you see show up that really are kind of disastrous on teams and in workplaces that we need to be aware of?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think of the ego as both our strengths and our weaknesses. And so, when we're looking at a team or an individual, we all have gifts that naturally show up, even if we're on autopilot, right? Our ego is what got us to where we're at. The good, bad, and ugly got us here. Unfortunately, when we step into leadership, get into marriages, become parents, have good close friends, we start to need to manage that ego back because it really takes care of me first. And so when you think about leadership within an organization, if you're taking care of me first or unconsciously making decisions to protect yourself, it doesn't come across as we. You don't typically end up at the finish line with everyone there. There might be a select few, or you might be there by yourself. And that's really where I think it becomes detrimental when you're not aware of your ego. What I like to do with people, there's 3 ego types. Identify what is their dominant and secondary ego. That's where the belief systems lie. If you typically fall under the complier ego, you're most likely motivated by being liked. You're people driven. You care deeply about others, and you're highly empathetic, which then leads you to struggle with, maybe holding people accountable, giving solid feedback, sharing your own thoughts, wisdoms, because you're really seeking approval, validation, and permission from the people around you. Because again, your ultimate motivator is to be liked. The next one would be the protector. And the protector is where all of our deep-seated values live. It's where our authenticity is, our courage, our bravery to speak truth, to hold ourselves to a high level of integrity and do what's fair and right, no matter who gets hurt, as long as it's fair and right, because that's just the right thing to do. So it really is where our integrity value lives. And unfortunately, when that's overused, that can be very black and white, very stubborn, very confrontational. The protector sometimes gets confused to be unrelatable and aloof, and they just don't care, or they can be incredibly aggressive because, again, they care very, very deeply. And then you've got the controller. The controller is motivated by winning and being the best. And so they typically move fast, think fast, run fast, and they're incredibly competitive. They typically are in leadership roles. They move really quickly. Unfortunately, the downside of controllers are they micromanage. They put tasks before people. They don't always think about the emotion behind it. So they're hyper rational. Again, these are all gifts until they're overused and then they become weaknesses. And so recognizing, these overused strengths are not terrible things. We just have to manage them back and recognize when they show up. When are we overusing them? I always say the sweet spot's about 33%. If we can pull 33% from the complier, the protector, and the controller, we're a very balanced leader. And that's really where we want to learn to be. One, you're completely conscious and intentional. Two, you understand what your true strengths and gifts are and where that line is. Now, obviously, different people have different lines and different people push us to different lines, and that's all okay. But we understand it because now we viscerally know what our best self looks like and what our worst self looks like. And we can have a clear definition of how to show up that way.
I love the way you're in detail describing, first of all, the three different aspects of the ego. And I like the way you talk about overused strengths, because I think in a lot of the work we do, I don't care what assessment you take, what work you do to know yourself, we all have strengths and we all have gaps or liabilities. And the way that I like to describe this stuff is, when does this serve you well? And when is it not serving you well? Or when is this a healthy expression of XYZ? And when is this a less than healthy or a flat out unhealthy or maybe even a toxic expression of XYZ? Because context matters, right? Knowing yourself matters. It's like, when do you lean on this for it to help you? And when do you need to back off? Because if you lean on it at all or lean on it too much, it's going to have disastrous consequences. And so it's getting off of that autopilot, that reactivity, like you said, to consciously, I know these aspects about myself. And so I'm going to kind of, not that we're machines, but pull this lever to ratchet this one up or pull this lever to ratchet this one down type of a thing, so we can have the impact. How do we get to that balance of the ideal 33% between them? Or how do we start to mitigate that so that we can show up as the best version of ourselves versus the unhealthy expression of one aspect or more of our ego hijacking us?
Yeah, I love that word hijacking, because really that's all it's doing, right? And it's an unconscious hijack. And we are then become a fight or flight. And our only survival is to clean it up. And we either avoid it or we aggressively try to fix a problem that can't be fixed. And so I love the terminology that you said, that question, does this serve you? Because when you start to think about how we all show up, no one ever stops and just asks, did that serve me? And that simple question is a conscious question, right? And I think in order to get the egos out of the room, everybody has to know their ego. You have to stop blaming each other and you have to start taking ownership. A lot of times we know that we can be too aggressive. We know we can be over caring or over giving or over committing. We know that we're not good delegators. And then there's this other component that, you think you do it well and you're giving yourself too much credit, right? And so those are all ego tactics. When you can get all the egos identified in a room, if you have 10 leaders on your team and every single person can learn which ego type they are, and then we can share that with the group, you now have such a different conversation to be had. I just had a conflict management call actually right before our interview, and it was just so fascinating. I've actually coached both of them individually. They're new to working together. And so I know both of them. One of them is a controller protector, which means they're task first. They speak directly. They move fast, think fast. They have high expectations, sometimes unrealistic ones, and they want direct leadership. His direct leader is a complier protector, which means they don't like to hold people accountable. They're kind of an absent leader. They just trust things are going to get done. They're okay. And they just avoid confrontation like the plague. And so what happened with these two, it was one conversation, but it was 3 months of buildup where there was resentment and there was blame and there was all this stuff. And all of a sudden they had this huge backlash in their conversation. And it became just miscommunication. Two egos talking. They do not talk the same language. And now you have two people who resent each other and think there's no way to work together successfully. It's crisis mode when that happens, because to me, it's like, wow, you changed 3 words and a little bit of body language and a tone. you have a completely different conversation. And that's really what we had to do today on this call is one, just take ownership. What was your part? Where did the leader not speak up? Where were they, not showing up and delivering and helping and mentoring, which is where the employee was feeling undervalued and underappreciated because he couldn't find his boss to give him feedback or do his annual review. Didn't seem like a big deal to the leader, but to this employee, it was a big deal because he just wants to be better. His whole goal in life is motivated by being the best and getting to the finish line quicker, faster, and more effectively. And if he doesn't have a leader that's telling him in 12 months how he can do that, he's incredibly frustrated, right? And so, simple thing. All they had to do is have their annual review on time. Or the leader could have apologized for not having it on time instead of getting defensive of why it didn't happen on time. And so I think that's a perfect example of where when we're not talking the same language, miscommunication happens all the time. So if we get in a room, understand the egos, you can now change language. The complier needs to know, why does this matter to the people? The protector needs to know, what is the fair and truth of this? What is the black and white facts that make this the right thing to do? And the controller needs to know, how are we going to get to the finish line fast? And so just those little bits of understanding creates more empathy. And when you can have empathy on a team, as you know, you can now have humans on the team. And when there's humans on the team, you have a different level of communication and respect for one another. And you've removed the egos out so that you're now talking people to people. And that's really the magic of this work.
I love that so much because I think it goes back to, we have to know ourselves, but then there's the power from a team standpoint of doing work like this with other people on a team because I can know myself and know when I need to regulate various aspects of myself that can be liabilities or frustrations for other people. And we all have parts of ourselves that we can't see as well. We all have parts of ourselves that become invisible to us at one point in time or another. And hopefully we have somebody in our life, in our team, ideally at work, who knows that and can shine that light when we can't see it. Or I like to say, lovingly call us on our crap. Right? And say, hey, you're doing this, and not in a judgy, shamey way. And we all need that. And when we don't have a psychologically safe team, where we don't have a space where we know these things about each other, in the absence of data, our brains filled in with stories. So we start to make up a story about this person that they're just a control freak or whatever. Well, no, it's just that aspect of themselves is really having some needs that aren't being met. So let's say a team, they know now what type of ego and stuff are on the team. What are some things that you would invite people to think about when how do you handle it when it creeps up? What are some things that people on teams can do very tactically and tangibly to take ownership and move beyond the unconscious habits of our ego hijacking us?
I think first and foremost, there has to be a culture that is, like you said, safe enough and open enough and encourages truth to be spoken without controversy, right? Which means there has to be a common language around the ego or the unconscious habits or behavior type, right? There has to be an invited conversation so that when it is given, it's not immediate reactive frustration, anger, denial, because that's what the ego wants to do. And if we don't create a space that says, hey, feedback is the only way for all of us to be better. Feedback is the only way for us to grow as a team and as individuals. And now it's just part of our daily communication. It's really hard to have those conversations. So I think first and foremost, you have to identify the unconscious habits that are happening on the team. You can pick out one person and say, this guy's the problem. I guarantee that guy's not the only problem. That thought in itself means you're probably a bigger problem than you're giving yourself credit for. And you are blaming the other person because they can only take such a percentage of the problem. So, I love when people say that because I want to let's take a step back. The first step to any confrontation you're running to, any miscommunication, what's your part? This is where I stop the blame immediately. What's your part? Whether it's 1%, 25%, or 97%, you own part of this.
Yep. Oh my God, I love that so much because I'm just laughing because I don't think there is a team yet that I've worked with that doesn't have at least one person that does the whole deflect and blame game. Oh my God, when you have someone, no, it's not me, it's them.
We all do it, right? The ego is a victim and a martyr. There's got to be the martyr that saves the day and it's the hero syndrome. There's got to be a victim that's victim to the circumstance and someone else is my problem. And so the reality is neither of those are wrong. It's just, again, unconscious. So if we're not aware of who falls into victim, who falls into martyr, and who does the blame game, nothing gets accomplished. So I think first and foremost, figure out those unconscious habits. The only way to do that, you have to do 360 reviews. When you can get that outside perspective, now it becomes a self-awareness game. Perception is not truth, but it is reality. And I think when we can get feedback that shows us the reality of the perception, we can now say, wow, that wasn't my intention. Oh my goodness. And that's usually the response you get when people start to see and hear their unconscious habits from other people. It's like, wow, I didn't think people knew I felt that way. One of the most common pieces of feedback that people get is, we want to hear more from you. You have a lot of wisdom to share. And that's almost on probably 80% of people's feedback. Everybody knows your dark side. Everybody knows your unconscious habits. You're the only one that doesn't. So I always laugh and say, let's figure it out. Let's own it so you can move on from it. As far as once they know these unconscious habits, that's when you can really start to shift and change them, because typically it's much easier to stop the blame game when you're like, oh yeah, okay, it's a consistent census that I typically don't follow through when I delegate tasks. So one of the most common things we hear is, well, I can't trust that people are capable, or, I delegate tasks, they can't do it as well as me. Well, that's a common thing that happens because there's probably not follow-up. There's probably not proper training involved. For complier leaders, it could be more of they're avoiding a tough conversation that needs to be had. Let's say there's conflict on the team, or they need to give some hard feedback and they just keep putting it off. Unfortunately, that passive behavior they think that they're avoiding drama. It actually creates more drama because everybody knows there's an elephant in the room. Everybody knows you're avoiding something. And so when you can start to recognize like, oh, that controller exploded because I was holding back for 3 weeks and my energy was more resentful or more avoidant than the friendly, outgoing person that I typically am. So they knew something was wrong. And then finally, when I lashed out passively, aggressively, they lashed out direct aggressively. And now we have a big blown fight versus just a discussion.
Man, there's so much of that. We could dive into and unpack. But yeah, what you're describing are just such common day to day. And I think they paralyze teams. And it's, I love that it's like, let's just have a common language and put it out there. And I love that you're using 360s as well, because I think it can help us see, oh, okay, or here's what I want to get to. Or gosh, I didn't realize, when I don't speak up, then here's the impact. And so I think that in the absence, if your organization is not doing a 360, I think there's value that if you can find people who you believe will be real with you, you can also get some of your own feedback that way, wouldn't you think?
Yeah. And, I think even just sitting out a survey, I just did a talk the other day. You have to remember everybody on your team has their own ego. And so if you've got compliers on your team or protectors, they're not going to want to give you direct feedback because they're going to try to avoid any level of, emotion or conflict. One of the easy ways to do it, if you don't want to do a formal 360, just send out an anonymous Google form that has some of those questions that said, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how am I doing as your leader? What would you like more of? What are my biggest, weaknesses as a leader? What are my biggest strengths? What do you think I do well? What would you like to see me do differently? And you ask the hard questions, the ones that you don't want to hear the answer to, because you know that there is going to be some tough feedback that you're going to have to digest. It stings, like you said, the ego wants to sabotage our world. The ego wants to disappoint us. That's where it has a purpose in our life. And, I think that's ultimately where when we do perceive ourselves as maybe doing a better job than what is actually getting pushed out in the world, a lot of times it could be for 2 reasons. One, it's our protective tactic to say, hey, I'm doing good, because if I don't, I have no worth and value. I'm a fraud. I'm an imposter. It's an insecurity thing. So they have to see them on a higher pedestal. Unfortunately, the sabotaging tactic is they're usually not on that pedestal. So they refuse to go internal. They refuse to hear the feedback. But usually what happens, I see in those situations, is internally, they're doing all the right things. In their head, it's like, I had a really good conversation with Sally down the hall. And unfortunately, Sally never heard that conversation, especially if you're in the protector zone. Like, protectors have conversations with themselves all day. And unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't get pushed out externally. They've had so many conversations externally. They are scared to have them because they're trying to avoid any levels of emotion, because emotion is scary. And I think when we can start to recognize, where is our introvert extrovert landing with certain people and certain ego types, we'll start to recognize that we're probably not pushing out all the good stuff that we want to do or that we're thinking about doing. And instead, it's harboring in us, or it's coming out in more of a reflection of resentment because we see someone else doing it really well and we think we can't do it. So it shows up in a way that is more sabotaging usually the traits that we need to adopt are the opposite of what we are capable of doing. Does that make sense? Or the ones we resent the most.
Oh, yeah, because it holds up a mirror, right? What's happening. So, for the people listening, you've been talking a lot about the 3 different ego types and how they show up. If people are interested, how do they even start to know what type of ego they have?
Yeah. On my website, I talk high level, some of the ego types out there, but I think in general, just being honest with yourself. Are you one that typically puts people for the task? Are you one that avoids confrontation? You typically go along to get along. You're a warm and inviting, caring person. You're friendly. You're fun. Typically, your complier ego type. Here's the kicker. This is where people are like, oh yeah, this is me. The downside of that, you take, and you can't take anymore and you explode. You go along to get along to a fault, right? Like you put everybody else's needs before your own, so you burn out or you get resentful. You really struggle to delegate because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, or you think it's a waste of their time because it's a tedious task, so you might as well take it on yourself. So you're at a leadership position still doing tasks that you may have always done because it's tedious. The protector, you're a visionary. You do what's right and fair. You have strong belief systems. You're a problem solver. I think that's the easiest one. Like you're constantly finding the problems in people and things and situations. I know it sounds very black and white, but you're a black and white thinker. And so really having to adopt gray, I think that's where the protector really has to kind of be honest with themselves. Do you snap quickly? Like you're cool until you're not. So a lot of times protectors they struggle to say, like, I either love or I hate. I'm either smart or I'm not. I'm either successful or I'm not. I'm either this or I'm not. And there's no gray in their inner belief system. And so really figuring out where that balance is. Then you've got your controllers. Your controllers are, again, they move fast, they think fast, super competitive, wants to always do the biggest challenge and do it best. Doesn't always have to be done correctly, but it has to be done fast and they have to win. And so that's kind of one of their downsides. The controller is probably the hardest one to be truthful. Complier protectors typically own where they're not good enough. They struggle more on owning their greatness, where controllers are more of they toot their own horn and can see their strengths. They really struggle with owning the micromanaging component. They're too direct. They don't take care of the people because deep down they care deeply as well. And it's really unintentional that people get forgotten in their world. But that's typically a common thing that when they're honest with themselves, they can be like, yeah, relationships always come second.
I love that because I think, as you're talking, I'm like, oh yeah, I can pick myself, but also other people. And I think, being able to just kind of go, yeah, these are my tendencies and owning that, I think is super helpful. So thank you for walking us through that. So speaking of the ego and some of those self-limiting aspects and narratives, one of the things that I've learned is that no matter how much work we've done ourselves, right, these aspects pop up and we all have self-limiting stories that pop up sometimes more often than not. And so what I would love, Christie, would you be willing to share what is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it so that you can still show up as a leader in your life?
Yes, it's such a good question. Oh my gosh. I always tell my clients, I will not lie to you from day one. Your ego will be with you from now until the moment you die. Like it is never going to go away. The whole goal is just to manage it a little bit more, right? Recognize it. If you're consciously going through the motions 90% of the time today, let's get you down to 75%. So with that being said, my ego shows up every day. Yes, I'm a controller protector, which means I like to win and I like to be right. So I can be incredibly stubborn. I always tell my clients, as long as I'm a sassy bitch, I'm good. Everybody likes me. If I'm just bitchy, it doesn't quite work. So, I've learned to really soften my elbows. But there's a couple areas right now in my life. I think one, as a business owner, I've been in business for 13 years, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I know I'm really good at it. I know I can change the lives of my clients. I've seen it happen. It's wonderful. It inspires me every day. And just on Friday, I had an event I was going to go to, and it wasn't a client. It was just speaking at an event, but it was more peers and it was local. And I woke up that morning and had butterflies. I was like, oh my gosh, what if they see me as a fraud? What if I just don't make an impact in this group? And, I was saying this out loud to my husband, knowing it sounded ridiculous, but I really, really genuinely felt that way in that moment. And he was just like, honey, you say this every time you're going to meet, go to an event. And then you always come home and say, oh, that was so awesome. I did a really good job and I nailed it. I think it's just one of those things. saying our fears and our emotions out loud, identifying that ego talk out loud naturally starts to diffuse it. And that's really that conscious component of it. When we can acknowledge it out loud, ask for help, have that vulnerability to say, hey, this is going through my head. Is this crazy or is this not crazy? And having those external partners to say, hey, that's crazy talk, or nope, that's actually going on and you should think that through. And I think that's really where the power lies, is when you get to own your good, bad, and ugly, you no longer have to hide it. And that is where you have freedom. And when you can find that place of freedom to just speak your ugly out loud, whether it's with your spouse, whether it's with your partners at work, whether it's with your employees, you become real and relatable. I think parenting, I just became a mom a year ago and we adopted 2 kiddos. So you had a 2 and a 4-year-old come into our house overnight. And you talk about everything I thought I had mastered in the ego world. Holy moly. I had a whole new world of ego show up. And let me tell you, my controller protector that had a very established foundation in my home of simplicity, I had to give up full control. Yes, there is no control in my world anymore. I now go moment to moment and we do not plan things because I will be disappointed.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that. Well, one, congratulations with that. But one thing I wrote this down, you said, speak your ugly out loud. And I think that there's something to be said for that, because when we keep it in our head, right, it runs us. And there's something to be said of, when you speak it, it actually ceases to have the power. And I love speaking it to someone else who can fact check us. But also, if we don't have someone to speak it to, one of the exercises we actually do in Dare to Lead that's part of the skill building of learning to balance and rise strong is you write out your story that's in your head, because when you read it, you're like, this actually sounds ridiculous. So it's about, in whatever way, shape, or form, getting it out of your head so you can fact check it. So I love that. I love that. I love that. That's so fantastic. All right. Are you ready for quick questions?
Let's do it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Fill in the blank. Living authentically is?
Speaking truth.
When the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader, what do you do?
I think that's when you dig deep, address your fears, talk about them, and then you courageously step up and show the world what you need to accomplish.
Awesome. What is something people would be surprised to know about you?
I am a hobby cattle rancher.
How does one a hobby cattle rancher? How does that happen?
Well, I guess I'm a 4th generation cattle rancher, but my husband and I, we have cattle. We both work full-time jobs and run businesses. But yeah, on the weekends and by night, we have cattle and we raise a ranch. Yeah.
All right.
I know, random, right? I thought I threw that one out. There was a few others, but that's probably the latest thing that hasn't been exposed to the world.
Wow, that is random. I love it. Okay. What is your favorite go-to movie?
Ooh, favorite go-to movie. That's a good one. This is so cheesy, but I would just have to say Top Gun. I mean, Maverick. Here we go.
There you go. The first one, or Top Gun Maverick, or both?
I actually really like both. I feel like the Maverick actually is more nostalgic this place in my life. In my 20s, I loved just straight up Top Gun. Yeah. Very inspiring.
I thought that Maverick did a good job of paying homage to the original. Yeah, I like both, but yeah, good. Awesome. All right. What's your go-to song?
Ooh, my theme song. I always tell my husband, if I die, this is what you're going to play. Beyonce, I Was Here.
Oh, nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's my ego manager. When I'm really down, I just play that and I scream it out loud. And it's like, get your shit back together, girl. You got this.
Oh my God, I love that so much. That's fantastic. All right. What is something you can't live without?
My family.
Got that there. All right. What is something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
A cup of Earl Grey tea with a little milk.
Very English of you.
Oh, it's the best. Just soothes the soul and brings everything back to grounded.
I love it. I love it. It reminds me of in college I studied abroad and we would have Tetley tea with little milk in it or whatever. And so that brings it back.
So good.
All right. And what are you grateful for right now?
What am I grateful for right now? I think right now I'm so still adjusting into the parenting where I'm really grateful for being blessed with this ego managed knowledge as I'm navigating this parenting world with my kiddos, especially they're going through trauma and they have a lot of emotions. So it's helping me manage mine in a way that I don't know how successful I would be if I didn't have it.
All right. Closing question, Christie. If you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
Oh, ownership. Own your shit so you can then make better choices. Yep.
Fair enough, right? Yeah, we got to own it. I love that.
Yeah. If you can own it, you can be more intentional.
That well put, simple and profound at the same time. Well, Christie, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for this awesome conversation. I have so enjoyed it, and I hope it brings a lot of value to so many people. I'm really appreciative.
Well, thank you for having me. Those were really good questions, by the way. It was a pleasure.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.